Welcome to VCR, Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
Game over! Game over, man!
You're in the wrong movie.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to fill the audience in on what's going on. So I've mentioned this group chat that I'm tangentially a part of. Blake shot me a message saying, do you want to record Alien this weekend? And I looked at it, and what I read was, do you want to record Alien and Aliens this weekend? So this is the first time in the podcast history that I'm actually more prepared than Blake. Yes. And it's completely by accident.
But are you more prepared, or are you equally as prepared, but twice as prepared for two movies?
Yes.
I didn't know where I was going there. I couldn't quite figure it out by the end, but I landed where I landed.
You landed where you landed.
I make no apologies.
No, leave it in. Leave it all in. We're doing it live.
We're doing it live. We're doing our first Sigourney Weaver movie, I think, on this podcast at this point.
Yeah, no. So again, Blake shot me a text being like, it's actor-actress month. Who do you want to do? And we kicked around a couple ideas.
Yep.
And we arrived pretty quickly at Sigourney Weaver, though.
Yeah, I mean, she's probably one of my top 5 favorite actresses of all time.
She's iconic. Like, she's up there. Like, you shot me a list of options, and again, we kicked around a couple different options, but pretty quickly it was like, oh, yeah, obviously Sigourney Weaver, right?
Yeah, right,
like,
right.
Why not?
Yeah. I think that to do Alien and Aliens back-to-back kind of also makes logical sense because this is the starting point of her career.
Essentially, it's certainly what made her famous. And I will say, and we'll get into this more over the next few weeks, but like when you accidentally watch them as a double feature, you notice a lot of, they make an interesting comparison pieces, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously they would because it's a movie and its sequel, but just in terms of like the different directions they both go in, it's very interesting.
Well, and direction's a great point, right? Because it's directed by the first movie that we're talking about today, and this is the primer spoiler-free episode of that, is the original Alien movie from 1979.
Right, directed by Sir Ridley Scott.
Yeah, who is probably one of my top 10 favorite directors of all time. He's very inconsistent, but has like some of the best and worst movies ever made.
I'll say this for Ridley Scott. He takes bold swings.
Yes, always.
Sometimes they hit and sometimes they do not. Like it's funny. So I just recently saw Gladiator for the first time and loved it. Like I think it's one of the greatest, one of my favorite movies of all time. Mm-hmm. But then I also remember watching Robin Hood when that came out in theaters and being like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah, not a great one. Not a highlight.
No. I remember when the sneering bald guy turned out to be evil, and I was like, no, really?
Honestly, this is very tangential to our conversation, but Robin Hood, maybe one of the most boring movies on Ridley Scott's entire filmography.
It's certainly up there, and I remember seeing Prometheus in theaters too. I remember having very conflicting feelings about that movie.
I rewatched that within the last 6 months, and it is a very flawed but ultimately somewhat pretty enjoyable movie.
Okay, then we'll go with that.
I think it's a movie that, you know what, I want to save this conversation for a deep dive in either Alien or Aliens conversation. So let's leave that and let's get into the plot of Alien as a summary here for people who haven't seen this movie.
So the plot of this movie is beautifully simple. The spaceship Nostromo is returning to Earth. All the crew members are in stasis, but then they are awakened when the ship's computer receives a nearby distress call. And some of the ship members don't really feel like investigating, but they are reminded that it's their policy and they will forfeit their shares if they don't, toe the line and follow protocol.
Right, because they're a mining vessel.
Yeah, they are a mining. They're essentially, and this has been pointed out a lot, they're essentially like blue-collar truckers in space, right? They're doing their job and they want to go home, right? Yeah. But anyways, a couple ship members go out onto this strange planet to investigate, and they eventually happen across, dun dun dun, a downed alien ship filled with a bunch of bizarre architecture and bizarre corpses, and one of them is attacked by an alien creature. You've seen this before. You've seen it in video games. The face hugger. something that attaches to your face. And they bring him back aboard the ship despite knowing that this will violate quarantine protocol. By the way, as soon as they said quarantine protocol, like that hits different in 2024.
Yeah.
I just had flashbacks to Tiger King and like wiping down my groceries and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Anyways, maybe
you're going too into spoilers.
Yeah,
here
now I'm just describing the movie.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll just leave it there.
You need to take a step back. At some point I'm going to cut what you just said, and I'm going to leave this part in so that people understand why I cut it.
Yeah, that's fair. Once again, before we started recording, Blake, you were like, "Are you prepared to say something?" And I was like, "I'm prepared to talk."
I guess they are two different things.
Yeah, exactly.
I think what's interesting about this movie, and I'm actually going to skip by the characters and we'll circle back to them in a minute, I think. This is a sci-fi horror film. And I would actually say the horror is the item that's more focused on from an experiential level. However, the sci-fi elements of this are extraordinarily fleshed out in the background.
Yes, absolutely.
I think what's really cool about this movie for a first-time viewer is a lot of the suspense that goes into each segment of the movie. Because I could almost describe to you, and I'm going to do this in the deep dive, that there's almost like three very separate like styles almost to this movie, and like three separate like chunks of this movie. And so the reason why I kind of cut you off is I think the first part is really all you need to know going into this one. And whatever you've already experienced or heard about this movie, because this is one of the more famous movies that we've done on this podcast.
Yeah, it's almost like, rewatching this movie again a few days ago, I was kind of in awe, like trying to like transplant my brain into the mind of a viewer in like 1979 of how like, because like the imagery of the Alien series is so iconic at this point.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine how terrifying and jaw-dropping this would have been in its prime.
Yeah, it's almost like, this is going to sound religious, and it is in a sense, but it's not. It's like almost like unholy. Like there's something like really disturbingly like, almost like perverse in a sense.
Yeah, no, and like even when the ship members go out onto the like, the dwarf moon or whatever it is, and they're like wandering around this desolate environment, I sat up a little straighter. I'm like, where the fuck did they film this?
Yeah.
Because this landscape doesn't look right.
Right.
Like this landscape looks almost, there's just something, pun intended, like alien about it.
Yeah, exactly. And like, so the first act of the movie, it feels separate in a sense from the second and then third act of the movie, because it is somewhat different. Like the first act of the movie is almost like this exploration and an almost like borderline adventure, except there's this like background tension that just like slowly simmers for a little while.
This like slow burn of unease.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly. So characters and people you may know, we've already mentioned that Sigourney Weaver plays a very young Ellen Ripley in this movie, who's a warrant officer. She's actually like the third or fourth lead in the film, or I guess I would say lead with maybe
air quotes,
because what's really cool about this movie is like it's a really tight cast, because it takes place on this remote mining ship, and there's maybe 8 characters total. But I think what the first act of this film does a really good job of is obfuscating who the main character is.
Right, yeah.
Like every character kind of feels relatively equally weighted in the first act of this movie, barring maybe some sinister glances and some thoughts like that. The other thing is like none of the characters' backstories are ever really explored in this movie.
Yeah, and there's 7 of them, and we get a bit about like their interactions and their dynamics, and like there's this great part about how like the engineering technician and the science officer are complaining that because they're like maintenance crew, they only get a half share.
Right.
And they spend a lot of the first act complaining about how they deserve a full share.
Yeah.
There's even this great moment where they're trying to decide who's going to go investigate the distress call on this alien planet. And the one guy's like, hey, I mean, I'll do it for a full share, like, or I'll do it for an extra share. Like, what do you want?
So we kind of build on the dynamics of all of these characters. So I'm going to go through all of them really, like, in terms of cast-wise, at this point, I think that Sigourney Weaver, obviously this is our focus for these next 2 episodes, but there are some really cool other casting choices in this movie. This movie being relatively small at the time it came out, mid-sized budget, like, by the time it was actually filmed, but there's some, like, relatively big names for this point in time.
Yes.
So Captain Dallas, the captain of the ship, is really the leader of this crew when we start the film. He's played by Tom Skerritt, who is actually 90 years old now, and we've actually done on this podcast last year, we talked about him.
Oh, really?
When we covered the movie Contact, which was in my top 5 last year.
Oh, yeah.
He plays Drumlin.
That guy.
Yeah.
Huh.
And he also, of recent, was in the movie, believe it or not, Ted.
Okay.
Playing himself.
Well, that's a very Seth MacFarlane thing to do. Get aging actors to play themselves.
Exactly.
Huh. Good for him.
Yeah, very like famous actor of the 70s and 80s, did some really cool stuff back then. But if you're not into like the older movies, you might actually have seen Tom Skerritt before, because like I said, he is 90 years old this year.
Happy birthday.
And then his second in command, the executive officer Kane, is played by John Hurt, who we recently talked about on this podcast, you and I, when we did Watership Down.
That's right, we certainly did.
Playing Bright Eyes. He has a very interesting role in this movie, which we will talk about in great detail when we get into the deep dive episode. But John Hurt has a very distinct voice, so you have also seen him in Snowpiercer. Actually, the movie Snowpiercer, which is one of like my favorites of the 2010s. He's also in V for Vendetta. He plays Ollivander in Harry Potter.
You've seen John Hurt.
Yeah.
Let's just put it this way. You've seen John Hurt.
Or you've heard of him, because his voice is used in many movies.
Yeah, I will always hear, I will always think of Hazel when I hear that voice.
Yeah, 100% agree. Ian Holm playing Ash, who's the medical officer on the ship, the shifty-eyed medical officer.
He certainly is, and we have a lot to say about Ash.
We certainly will in the deep dive. He is known for playing Bilbo Baggins in the Lord of the Rings movies.
Really?
Yeah, like
holy shit!
You didn't put that together?
I see it now.
Oh my god! Like Ian Holm has one of the most recognizable faces that ever.
Oh my god!
I can't believe you didn't put that together.
I didn't, but I see it now.
That's hilarious. I can't believe you missed that connection.
Huh.
Lambert, who I didn't actually write down what Lambert's role is on the ship, but she is the other female on the ship, played by Veronica Cartwright, who Jason and I actually covered in some detail when we did the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which was my favorite movie of last year. So these are all actors that, they've been in movies that I was a big fan of in the last year. So I was actually really excited to see all of these random people on screen together.
Yeah, and they certainly do. Again, we talked a lot in our previous episode, The Big Lebowski, about casting and how important that is. And this is another film where I really appreciate the casting,
Yeah.
Again, a lot has been said about just the rugged blue-collar interior of this ship. And, you look at a picture of all these characters standing together, and it just looks like a bunch of people who are on the job.
Yeah.
They would never hang out with each other outside of these circumstances, but they all have bills to pay.
100%. And to round it out, probably the two characters who best represent that are Brett and Parker, the two maintenance guys you mentioned before.
Oh, yeah.
Harry Dean Stanton representing Brett. He is one of my favorite character actors of all time. I guarantee you have seen Harry Dean Stanton in a movie before. He was making movies right up until he passed away in 2017. You'll know him from, oh my God, there's literally too many movies to explain where he's from. He's in absolutely everything, and he's fantastic in absolutely everything. Yeah, I'm talking to you, the viewer, the listener at home. Just Google him, take a look at his face, and you'll instantly be like, oh yeah, that guy. That guy. He's he's like the poster child for that guy.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, really, we've already talked about Ridley Scott's role slightly in this movie, that he was the director of this film. I'm going to talk about the writer of this movie when we do the deep dive, because I think that's really interesting for if you've already seen this movie. and some of the art style and stuff like that, like where that originated from.
Yeah, Dan O'Bannon, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I want to talk about him too. By the way, I'm looking at a picture of him right now, and he looks like Santa Claus, just like Santa Claus.
Nice.
He looks like Santa Claus if he gave up his job at the North Pole and became a sci-fi writer.
Yeah, Dan O'Bannon is somebody who I've watched multiple times this year, some of his stuff, so I'm actually looking forward to talking about him as well. Who is this movie for, and does it hold up to a modern watch? I'm going to start by saying that despite this being one of the most famous, iconic movies of all time, this is somewhat of a niche movie. And what I mean about that is this movie does a really good job of threading the needle between a sci-fi film and a horror film.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's also like an incredibly slow-paced movie. And I don't mean that in even a bad way necessarily, if you're fully on board with that.
This was the 70s when people still had attention spans, so
yeah,
you're going to have to be a little patient.
Well, and it's methodical in its pacing. Like, it understands that things are moving slow, but it's doing it with intention.
Absolutely. And let's say it builds to a very explosive climax.
Yeah, like the second and third act become by about the midway point of this movie, things are really taken off.
Yeah, absolutely. Pun intended? Question mark?
Maybe.
Ah.
So I think that, like, if you're not on board with that slow pacing, this one's probably not for you, but it is very rewarding to watch in that sense. And it's also just like cinematically like one of the greatest achievements in film of all time.
I should also say that I do think this movie actually holds up pretty well considering.
Yeah.
But there are some, let's just call them egregious horror movie cliches. We'll talk about them more in the spoiler episode where, like, they're a little obvious and groan-inducing now, but in 1979 they probably weren't as obvious.
Well, and that's again like a product of its own success, right? Like we've talked about this in previous episodes where if a movie hits like the stratosphere of being this famous and this influential, you've already seen clips of what this movie originated, right? And other things since.
Absolutely.
So I think, if I say Chestburster, something is going to come to your mind. If
we say face hugger, something is going to come to your mind.
Yeah, like stuff like that. Like you have seen that, whether it's in Family Guy or it's in like
Spaceballs
or like Dead Space or like,
or
any
like Half-Life. Yeah.
Yeah, like any sort of video game, movie, novel, like whatever. You kind of already have an expectation of what that is.
I was going to wait till next episode to plug this, but I'm just going to plug it now. One of my all-time favorite YouTubers, Super Bunny Hop, has a video on the Alien films and how they influenced video games. Mm-hmm. I would highly recommend it.
Cool. So it's a movie that like it holds up relatively well because it's so iconic and because it's shot so well. So much thought went into the background and the design of the sets and everything that there's not really much dated stuff going on. It's just, like you said, some of the cliches are actually, because of this movie, they are now cliches.
Yeah, really. And again, you have to remember that this was pre-CGI, so like all the shit you're looking at was actually there.
Yeah.
Like people actually had to build it, right?
Yeah. Okay, so one scene to sell movie. What are you thinking?
I think it's number 2 on the Movieclips channel. It's the Chestburster Scene.
Mm-hmm.
And need I say more? It is the scene that really, honestly, like in the past, I've talked about how some movies are sold on their direction, some are sold on their performances, and some movies are just sold on one amazing, iconic scene.
Yeah.
And this is that movie scene. We kind of all know what happens, so much so that I'm not even going to describe it to you because you probably already know what happens. But like, this is one of those movies where if I could go back in time and watch it in theaters with an audience, I would do so because people must have been browning their pants across the board, right?
It was, from what I understand and reading, a very visceral reaction to this scene.
Yeah, actually, I'm a huge Bill Hader fan, and he actually talked about this scene in a podcast recently where he talks about how everybody in their life has had a moment where like you're at a dinner, like maybe you're out at a restaurant or at a family dinner, and like maybe someone starts choking or someone has a heart attack, and it's that slow burn realization of like, oh shit, something's wrong and we need to do something. Right.
Yeah.
So
I feel like you're talking about me for a very specific reason there. But,
hey, it's up to you if you want to share that story.
I've only given the Heimlich once, all right?
Okay.
But no, I know exactly what you mean. And also, it's also because of the fame of that scene. Like, it actually is rated one of the most famous movie scenes of all time. And for good reason. Like, it's incredibly memorable. And it's been repeated so many times that even if you haven't seen this movie, you've likely seen how the scene plays out, maybe with comedic tones or whatever.
Yeah, again, like a Spaceballs is the iconic example.
Yeah.
But it's such a piece of pop culture that I think sometimes you forget just the visceral horror of that, right? Like imagine, I guess we'll talk about
of everything going 0 to 100 real quick.
Yeah, or even just like the level of like violation that scene entails.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it more in the spoiler episode, but
definitely
there are precious few things I can imagine that would be more horrifying than that.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to agree with you. Like, there's not many scenes on Movieclips of this movie for the one scene to sell a movie, so we have 1 in 5 picks. And honestly, I really don't think you can go wrong with this one as your choice. Like, it's the iconic scene in the movie. It's something that even if you haven't seen it, you've probably seen it, or you actually have a pretty good idea of what happens in it. And if that, for whatever reason, isn't what you're interested in seeing, like, you can probably just not tune into this movie because, like, the perverseness of it, the horror of it, the shock factor of it, like, all of that is something that plays into the rest of the movie. And so if you're not into that, then this is probably the hopping off
Hey man,
point for
if
you.
you're not on board, you gotta brown or get off the pot. I don't know.
So when to watch? I find this a bit of a weird movie because, I guess I'll preface this by saying that I watched this on a weekday and I was exhausted, and I found that the pacing was a little bit more to my detriment because I was so tired, and I was slightly less invested than I normally am watching this movie, because this is a favorite of mine.
Yes.
It's definitely in my top 10 sci-fis or top 20 sci-fis of all time. It's a movie that I've watched multiple times, but I think that watch environment actually did hurt my experience a little bit because I wasn't absorbed into it. So
okay, you were a little taken out of it.
Yeah, so I think this is a movie that you've got to be awake, you've got to be ready to just like let yourself be fully invested in everything going on. Like, this isn't a movie that you have to pay attention to because the pacing's going to kill you in that sense. Like, you just have to, like, I think check this out on like a Saturday night, like when you're fully ready to like be whisked away by a movie.
My only caveat would be that this is an evening movie.
Yeah,
this is
definitely.
This is a lights out kind of movie.
Yeah, after sunset.
This is a lights out, double check the front door kind of movie.
Yeah, agreed. It does definitely play up to the horror element of the movie. Like, the tones are there, and it's also a movie that's slightly claustrophobic, right? Like, most of the movie takes place on a ship.
The Nostromo, which is a great name for a ship.
Yes, the Nostromo. And it's really, really far away from anybody or anything. Like, there's nobody coming to help any of these people.
Oh, I mean, like, setting-wise, or just premise-wise, this is a killer premise.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and I mean, can we talk about the iconic tagline for this movie?
Yes.
In space, no one can hear you scream.
Yes, I was going to bring that up later.
You know what? We talk a lot about the failings of marketing departments in terms of movies and trailers and stuff, but somebody was on point that day.
This is also one of the greatest movie posters of all time, and that certainly doesn't hurt.
No,
that's
not at
on
all.
There.
This is a movie that was maybe sold on its poster.
Yeah, I very much agree. Where to watch? Right now, it is streaming on Disney Plus, and as we've mentioned, there's not only a sequel of this called Aliens, but there's also, like, I'm gonna spit out a number saying about 7 Alien movies, direct Alien sequels.
Yep, and 2 of them are good.
2 prequels, and several, I think 2 off the top of my head, Alien versus Predator crossovers, and we will talk about all of those in the deep dive episode. Spoilers: I haven't watched all of them yet.
Well, uh-oh. Uh-oh. Oh, boy. I will, again, this is another one of those franchises where you can make the argument for it being a victim of its own success. I mean, Aliens came out like 7 years later, and we'll have a lot to say about that. And then I would love for us to do Alien 3 at some point, just so we can talk about like the legendarily difficult production process.
Right.
Yeah. We almost lost David Fincher because of that.
That's a great point.
No, David Fincher almost retired because
before he even really got started.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And that would have been a damn shame.
Maybe that'll be my birthday episode, actually. Just Alien 3.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Get them all out.
I don't even care about the movie so much. I just want to talk about the like horror that went on behind the scenes. I think there's even a documentary about how bad the production process was.
Yeah, fair enough.
I think it's called like Warts and Rags or something. I don't know.
Oh, look it up, and then we'll talk about it in the deep dive episode maybe a little bit.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I think right now you can check these all out on Disney Plus. Like literally, I looked it up, and every single Alien movie or Alien-related movie is on Disney Plus right now to check out.
Give it 2 years and this podcast will be on Disney Plus.
Yeah.
Pretty soon everything's going to be there.
Well, and the other thing is that's really exciting, and part of the reason why it also somewhat makes sense to do this episode now is Alien Romulus is coming out this year.
That's right.
Actually, like 2 months. I believe it's in August.
Well, I'm looking forward to not seeing it.
I will debatably go check this one. I probably honestly won't go check this one out. This one might be a watch at home kind of movie.
Yeah.
But to wrap up, like, where do you sit on the Alien movies? Like, are you a big Aliens guy, or, you know, did you get off the Alien bandwagon a long time ago? Like, where are you?
Not only did I get off the Alien bandwagon a long time ago, I never really got on it.
Oh,
I think we've talked before about how I have a weird blind spot with sci-fi.
Yeah.
Like, just I bounce off a lot of sci-fi movies, and I don't really know why that is. You know, even the sci-fi pick that I did for our Best of 2010s episode a couple months ago was barely even a sci-fi movie. But I will say I enjoyed watching these two movies back to back, and I enjoyed Alien quite a lot, but I think I enjoyed Aliens a little more.
Interesting.
And we can talk about that as the month goes on.
Yeah,
but,
for sure.
No, I enjoy this movie quite a lot.
Yeah, I think that because, and you know what, we'll leave this to a more spoiler-full discussion, but, you know, with Alien and Aliens almost being completely different genres of movies, I think, you know, there are people who are going to be diehard Alien fans, there's going to be people who are diehard Aliens fans, and then there's a lot of other movies that exist.
It's just interesting, too, and I mean, this isn't a spoiler, everyone kind of knows this. The fact that we have this iconic horror movie in 1979, then 7 years later, 1986, we get a sequel by a different director that's also a fully different genre.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I was like watching Aliens this week, even though I didn't have to. I was kind of like, imagine if like the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie is, you know, Jason Voorhees chasing teenagers around Camp Crystal Lake. Then like
You're not talking Nightmare on Elm Street.
What's the Jason Voorhees one?
Is that I Know What You Did Last Summer?
No, it's I'm gonna choose a different analogy, and it's up to you if you want to leave this one in. It's like, imagine if like, you know, you've got the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie, which is like Freddy Krueger chasing teenagers around with his like.
Oh, I got one.
Wait, let me finish. So you've got the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie, which is Freddy Krueger chasing teenagers around. And then it's like, imagine if there was Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, where we gave all those teenagers guns, and they're the one chasing a bunch of different Freddys around. Like,
yeah.
It's just kind of funny.
It's like the first half of Evil Dead 2.
Yeah.
And then the last, like, all of Army of Darkness.
Kind of, yeah. How's that for an analogy, you listener?
The true fans are going to know.
Yeah, the true fans, such that they are.
Okay, well, I think that's it for the spoiler-free discussion of the movie Alien and some of the history of this movie and a little bit our personal experiences with this film series. And we're going to talk about all of that in greatly more detail in the deep dive episode next week.
Greatly more detail.
Yeah. Okay, and we will see you next time. Tell your dad.
Tell your dad if he's alive.